Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Director of the Center for the Neurobiology of Learning and Memory, Dr. Michael Yassa.
Good evening and welcome, and Happy New Year to all of you. I am delighted to welcome you all here tonight for another celebration of knowledge and discovery, that is the 26th Distinguished Lecture on Brain, Learning, and Memory. Tonight we are hosting our 81st speaker in this series, which was founded in 1995 by our very own Dr. James McGaugh, who's with us in the audience, so let's give him a hand. And just to put it in perspective, in 1995, this was really a true collaboration with our community members, many of whom who worked with him on this lecture series are also here today. And 26 years later, you still continue to come out, especially on a Monday night. So I just want to take a moment to thank you all for being here, taking the time out of your day to come and hear about some science, which is really awesome. So thank you all. This series is, to me, a prime example of how UCI is leading the way when it comes to public education and service. 2019 was a great year for UCI indeed. UCI was rated, again, number 9 public university by US News & World Report. We are also rated as number 1, according to both Forbes and Money magazines. And in the fall of 2019, we had a record, an all-new record of 117,000 students that sought admission to UCI as undergraduates, the largest number of applications of any University of California. So really, we must be doing something right. So let's give us a hand as UCI community. We also launched our $2 billion, very ambitious, Brilliant Future campaign. And of course, our chancellor, our provost, the whole campaign team, and our vice chancellor for advancement, Brian Hervey, who's here with us today, deserve a lot of credit for pulling through and making this happen. Many members of the UCI Foundation Board of Trustees are also here with us. So I want to take a moment to thank them for their efforts on UCI's behalf and for really doing their best to make sure that this dream comes true. Thank you all. One of the best things about what we're doing, of course, is doubling down on our commitment to community education and public service. Our community is really Orange County. It's you. And UCI would be nothing and nowhere without your support. So thank you again. I want to thank all the people that work tirelessly to make sure that programs like this are executed well and that you are having an excellent experience and enjoying yourself tonight. That includes all the staff and volunteers at the Center for the Neurobiology of Learning and Memory, as well as the Irvine Barkley Theater. I especially want to thank the president of the Irvine Barkley Theater, Mr. Jerry Mandel, who is likely seatless at this point because he gives up his seat regularly. I'm not sure if I see Jerry right now, but I just want to take a moment to thank Jerry for hosting us again in Orange County's top destination for the performing arts. Let's give it up for the Irvine Barkley Theater and Mr. Jerry Mandel. It is delightful, again, to be here with you all tonight. Now, next up, I'd like to introduce someone who will actually introduce our speaker tonight. Please help me welcome my dear friend and colleague, the Dean of the School of Social Ecology, Dean Dr. Nancy Guerra.
Whoa, the lights are bright. Thank you so much. I have the great pleasure tonight of introducing our speaker for the 26th Distinguished Lecture on Brain, Learning, and Memory. She has been described as a neuroscientist who answers philosophical questions by studying the brain. Now just think about that for a minute. She is a professor emerita of philosophy at the University of California, San Diego, and an adjunct professor at the Salk Institute. Her research lies at the intersection of neuroscience and philosophy. She has received a MacArthur Prize, also known as the Genius Award, for her work in neurophilosophy. So what exactly is neurophilosophy? Does anybody here know? So we can look to Stephen Colbert, who said, when he hosted her on his show, "Did you just put the neuro on there because as a philosophy major you would never get a job?" That's a great joke. Clearly, our speaker has successfully helped neuroscientists and philosophers alike grapple with our evolving understanding of the brain and how new research can answer philosophical questions about where our moral values and ideas come from. Our speaker has authored several books, including her latest, Conscience, The Origins of Moral Intuition, which was published just last year and will be available at her book signing in the lobby. And I will say, I thought in advance of introducing her I should read her book, so I have been reading it this weekend, and it's fabulous. She's been president of the American Philosophical Association and the Society for Philosophy and Psychology, and has been the recipient of many distinguished prizes, including the Rossi Prize for Neuroscience. So please help me in giving a warm welcome to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Patricia Churchland.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, and especially to be part of this super distinguished series. And I love the idea that both the community and the people within the Academy get together, share some time, and really have a very good time. So, the origin of moral intuition. In 1975, the great biologist Ed Wilson said, "The evolution of human sociality is the fundamental conundrum of biology." And I want to tell you a story tonight about what has happened in a whole range of sciences that has taken that from being a fundamental conundrum to being a problem that is partially solved. The relevant sciences, of course, include genetics, but also the various subsets of anthropology, both the people who study civilizations, the people who study animals, both in the wild and in captivity, and also the bones and stones people, who managed to enlighten us about our lineage and earlier kinds of hominins. So the story has a number of parts, and of course, this being biology, they're all complicated. But what I'm going to try to do is to move back a little bit from the complexity and give you the basic outline of how the story goes. So the story really starts as we think about the basic kind of value that every organism must have. Anything that moves or perceives must have the wiring to see to its own survival. And there's a certain sense in which the value of survival and well-being is built into the very structure of the nervous system itself. And this means, as Paul MacLean used to say, that an animal needs to thrive and succeed at the 4 F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproduction. And if you don't succeed at those 4 F's, what happens is your genes do not get passed on. And so we live in a world of many kinds and many species of animal where we all share this fundamental value. Now, observing this and observing how evolutionary biology works motivated many evolutionary biologists to think that the appearance of altruism was a real problem, that it couldn't be genetic in its nature, because if it were, it would soon be wiped out. That is, any animal who was just nice while the others were feeding on its offspring would not pass on its genes. And so Richard Dawkins, in his first book, made the observation that we need to try to teach generosity and altruism because we are born selfish. Now, it's interesting to me that Darwin had a very different view. And in his book, The Descent of Man, published in 1871, Darwin asked the question, where does our moral sense or our conscience come from? Incidentally, just as an aside, by moral, I'm going to mean here that you make a moral decision when you decide to incur a cost to yourself in order to benefit someone else. It's a very simple definition, but it will serve the purposes at hand. So Darwin, in addressing this question, thought that there were essentially three components. He thought that we had a social instinct. We like to be together. We feel the pain of disapproval. We feel the pleasure of approval. We suffer when we are isolated. He also thought that a component had to do with what we learn postnatally, that we acquire habits and skills that allow us to navigate our social environment. And finally, there isn't just the habit that is then repetitiously produced, but rather there is also problem solving. And so that in certain contexts, when conditions change, we might modify a practice or a norm. Now, interestingly, this is a view that he shared with Aristotle, with Confucius, and with my two favorite Scotsmen, David Hume and Adam Smith. And since this is close to Robbie Burns Day, I felt that was appropriate. So what the story that I want to tell you is how this speculation on Darwin's part about the role of social instincts, habits and skills, and problem solving has come to be embellished and fleshed out with evidence from all of the sciences that I mentioned. Now, a couple of things are going to be useful as sort of brush clearing. And the first is that thing about definitions. And it's a really important discovery, actually made by Eleanor Roche at Berkeley in the 1960s, that most of our workaday concepts have a radial structure. They are not precisely defined. And by a radial structure, I mean that they have core examples where everybody agrees. They have fuzzy boundaries where, nobody really knows what to say. And falling off with declining degrees of similarity from the core cases are everything else. So what do I mean? What are examples? Vegetable. Everybody agrees that a carrot is a vegetable. Radishes, well, not so much. Some people think they are, and some people think they aren't. And what about chanterelle mushrooms? They're out on the boundary. Sometimes you find them in Whole Foods, and sometimes you don't. But are they really vegetables? Well, there is no answer to that. And we don't really care. I mean, one of the wonderful features of the workaday human languages is that we work very well with these concepts that have radial structure. Another example, house. It does not admit of a precise definition, but we manage pretty well nonetheless. And I'm showing you this one partly because I want to emphasize that, of course, there are cultural differences too. What is a prototypical case of a house for an Inuit living in the Arctic is very different from what is the prototypical house for someone living in Texas. Now, the reason I mention this is that I want to make the same point about the imprecision and the radial structure of concepts in the social domain. No one can identify a precise definition for friend, or what it is to be honest, or what it is to be truthful or empathetic. But we do know the core cases, and we do know when the cases fall well outside. And that seems to work pretty well. And I think the same considerations hold for these other more broad categories of what it is to be moral and not moral. So that's just a little aside. Now, I mentioned that the anthropologists who study animals have been very important in allowing us to see kinds of social behavior somewhat similar to what we see in humans, somewhat different. We see consolation behavior. We see grieving after a death. We see orphan adoption. Chris Besh has 5 distinct cases of males adopting baby chimpanzees whose mothers died or were killed, and took care of them until they were able to be independent. Now, some of the evolutionary biologists said, yeah, I bet those were the real dads. So Besh had some eager graduate students. He sent them out to collect the urine. And we now know that not one of the adoptive fathers was a biological father of the infant. We also see examples of self-control, of often very complicated problem solving, and of cooperation. A further way in which I think our understanding of social behavior in not just humans but others expanded as a result of anthropologists who try to get evidence about our very far distant ancestors. And I particularly like this slide because on the vertical axis you see years in millions. So look, about 1.8 million years ago. And here is Homo erectus. Had a brain of about 800 cc's. Yours is about 1,500, or maybe only 1,300, depending on how you're doing. And across the horizontal axis, what we see is geographical spread. So we think that about 1.8 million years ago, Homo erectus started here. It turns out they had the use of fire. They also managed to get themselves to Indonesia by making rafts and loping them together with vines. So there they are. Now here we are, Homo sapiens. We've been on the planet about 300,000 years. Not trivial, but nothing like Homo erectus. Now, the reason I mention this is that these guys were pretty successful, and humans have been pretty successful living in small hunter-gatherer groups. And what we have to assume, but not just assume because we have data from existing hunter-gatherer groups, is that they had forms of social practices, of norms. They had ways of dealing with their own social problems, of what to do with miscreants, how to get cooperation, how to deal with resource depletion, and so forth. And the reason that's important is these guys did not have anything like systematic religion. And although it's a common assumption that we know the origin of morality, it's divine, and that all we have to do is make the right connection with the right divine, and we know what we're to do. But that does not look right from the point of view of anthropology. These guys did very well, and of course we know from acquaintance with some of these groups, such as the Inuit who live in the Arctic, that they had a rather deep understanding of the moral structures of their group, but they did not have organized religion. So what about organized religion and its relation to morality? And here again, the anthropologists are helpful in observing that we really only see the rise of organized religion about 10,000 years ago when agriculture became quite widespread. there was herding, there was cultivation, and so forth. What changed was that the size of the group, which in the hunter-gatherer case is only about 20, 30 to 50, the size of the group completely changed. Groups became very large and very settled. And that introduces a really different dynamic. And those of you who grew up in small towns like I do will be familiar with that dynamic. In a small town, everybody knows everybody else. It doesn't take much to keep people in line, like a frown or a It doesn't take much. But when you have a very large community and not everybody knows everybody else, it might not be a bad idea to invent the idea of an unseeing being who sees you do the bad things. And so, and it can be very effective. But I think it is not the source of our moral intuitions. It is, if you like, built upon the sociality that is already there. Now, we already know, and actually Ed Wilson, I think probably better than most of us knew, that there are highly social, highly successful insects. So is our sociality just like that? And the answer is clearly not. It's not because in the case of mammals and birds, we have such great flexibility in adapting to particular circumstances as they change. And whereas a termite pretty much has to do what the genes told the brain to build itself to do, we are a little different. And that's the first part of the story about the brain that I want to tell you. So, about 200 million years ago, something really rather astonishing happened on the planet. And that is that warm-blooded animals appeared. Now, why was that so great? Well, for one thing, it was a tremendous advantage because they could forage at night, sometimes forage on the very cold-blooded things that were waiting for the sun to come up. They could also inhabit climates that were much colder. Now, as always in biology, when there is a great advantage, there's always a great cost. So what's the cost? And the answer is quite astonishing. It's that gram for gram, a warm-blooded animal has to eat 10 times as much as its cold-blooded cousin. It has to have 10 times the calories. And that means that's a huge constraint on how successful it must be in foraging. Now, the answer that Mother Nature found was make it smart. That if you, and by make it smart, that's going to mean take learning as it exists in pre-mammalian animals, scale it way up, and scale it way up so that no matter what environment the animal finds itself in, its brain will tune itself up to that particular environment. And by gosh, that is what we do. And the structure that was invented by Mother Nature, if I may be anthropomorphic, the structure that was invented was the cortex. All mammals have cortex, and only mammals have cortex. Birds, we now know, very recent discovery, have something that's probably somewhat analogous, so I'm going to leave birds aside. But this amazing organ that consists in these layers of highly structured, clearly specified organization is unique to mammals. Now, the cool thing about having your brain be a big learner and tuning itself up to the environment is that when you're born, your brain has to have room to grow. So, for example, in this slide, we see a pack of neurons in the newborn. And at 1 month, you can see that sprouting has occurred all over those neurons. The sprouting gets denser and denser and denser. So the brain has to have room to grow if it's going to be a big learner, if it's going to adapt to its conditions. Okay, so what? A big thing. The big thing is that with the evolution of endotherms, your learning capacity goes up, but your independence goes down. So you're born helpless. And that's true, of course, of all mammals and all birds. So now Mother Nature has a problem. She figured out big learning was the cool thing to do here, but now you've got these highly dependent, helpless offspring. And the solution there was to take what was already in the animal's brain, modify it somewhat so that that old deep value of caring about my own survival and well-being gets extended to the offspring. And now I don't only care about my own food and warmth and safety, I care about the food and warmth and safety of the infants. So how was that achieved? And the answer, of course, is very complex, and we're not going to deal with the complexity, but we are going to talk about the one thing that we know about that story that turned out to be crucial, and that was oxytocin and the sibling peptide vasopressin. These turned out to be crucial in attaching the parent to the offspring and the offspring to the parent, so that when the baby is cuddled and nurtured and held, oxytocin is released in the brain of the mother and in the brain of the infant. And what the oxytocin does is, amongst other things, it helps to attach the two, to bond the two to one another. It also turns out that oxytocin is released in areas that contain endocannabinoids, and in some cases, endogenous opioids. Those are the cannabinoids your own brain makes. So when oxytocin is released, endocannabinoids are released, and you feel good. And that, of course, helps with attachment. The oxytocin is released in the hypothalamus, a very ancient structure. We won't go into the details of all that, but it's released into many places, including, as I said, into places where you feel pleasure, the nucleus accumbens in particular. Now, there are other parts to the story, but oxytocin and vasopressin are absolutely crucial for this bonding and for the pleasure, the feeling of great attachment to the offspring. But just so I can say that I didn't completely skate over the complexity, there are a host of other neurochemicals that are very important in the story. Galanin is one, and estrogen is another. And these are interesting because while oxytocin is critical for attachment, these also control very specific kinds of parental behavior, such as getting the rat pup and putting it back in the nest, and that called pup retrieval. Pup grooming, where the mother licks and licks and licks, and all that licking turns out to be really quite essential. All right, and this is just to say the endocannabinoids and the endogenous opioids are also important. So here's the money point, and that is that the basic mechanisms of attachment are the mechanisms for caring. And that small genetic and epigenetic changes can shift the attachment portfolio. And I'm going to give you examples in a moment of what that shift looks like. And that the pleasure of attachment is deeply rewarding. So let's think about expanding the attachment from mother and baby to maybe something else. And so I'm going to talk about the story of the voles. Now, as you know, I'm sure, there are many, many species of voles. And montane voles, which I'll tell you about first, are kind of what we all think about like rodents. So the male and the female, they meet, they mate, and then they go their separate ways. So she's going to have the baby, so she's got to make a nest and so forth, and he's looking for more action. Now, it turns out, however, that prairie voles who live in the open prairie are deeply social. The male and the female meet, they mate, and now they're bonded for life. And that means that the male helps rear the pups, he guards the nest, he shoos other females away. Most of their sexual action takes place between the pair. It also turns out that the offspring, as they grow up, help take care of the next litter of pups. And it's much more a sort of community kind of a spirit. Now, when this was first noticed, I mean, people thought, actually, when I told Colbert this story, I said, what's the difference in the brain? And he said, the prairie voles are Christians. Well, they're not, of course. So when the neuroscientists tried to answer that question, what's the difference in the brain, they came up with what is probably the principal difference, and that's shown in this slide. And this is a little awkward, so I'm going to talk you through it. So this is a slice of montane vole brain, taken like if you went this way, and this is prairie vole brain. Now, what you see in dark as opposed to light is staining for either oxytocin receptors, to which oxytocin binds so it can have an effect, or vasopressin receptors, to which vasopressin binds so it can have an effect. And what do we see? In the prairie voles, in this area of the reward system, where there are also endocannabinoids, we see a high density of receptors for oxytocin. It means oxytocin can really get in there and do a lot. And what about for vasopressin? Well, we see that in another part of the reward system, the ventral pallidum, there's a high density of receptors for vasopressin in the prairie voles. So it turns out that was the crucial difference. There are other differences possibly as well. And that turned out to be a really very surprising result. Of course, you want to check that result in the many ways, block the oxytocin receptors, and what happens? The prairie voles meet, they mate, and they don't care. So they behave like montane voles. A related discovery, which I think is quite interesting, is this. So I told you that the prairie voles can be very social. Now, suppose you take prairie vole pups, and you make sure they're fed and kept warm, but they aren't cuddled, they aren't licked. What happens to them? It turns out that their social behavior is not normal for a prairie vole. They are not intensely social. They don't make good mothers, they don't make good fathers, they don't form lifelong bonds, and they don't help in the way that prairie vole offspring do. They don't help with the next litter. And of course, this tells us something that has long been expected, and that is that there is an important relation between gene expression, in this case, gene expression that makes the protein that is the oxytocin receptor, and an environmental effect. So when we think, oh, well, is it nature or is it nurture here? The answer is it's both. And we can see that it's both because you can change the nurture part of things. That changes the gene expression. So what we know then is that there are many species of mammals that are not highly social, but many that are. Only about 5% form long-term bonds. But it's interesting that they do, and we think, of course, that it is an adaptive response to the particular ecology. So we can see that you can make small genetic changes, probably having to do with the location of oxytocin receptors and vasopressin receptors and maybe a bit of something else. And you can extend care from offspring to mates, or, depending on the species you are, from offspring to kin. So in this slide, we see marmosets, who are long-term pair bonders, and the male actually does more of the parental work than the female. Once the babies are born, he carries them around a lot. He will also adopt orphans. And this is sort of for the Canadians in the audience. Beavers are also long-term bonders. But as I said, there can be different styles of affiliation and bonding. In the case of olive baboons, for example, the strongest connection, apart from offspring, the strongest connections are between mothers and daughters and her daughters and her daughters and so forth. So they have these matrilines. And that's partly because the young males in the olive baboon troops leave to find a new troop. So here's the way I think about the link to morality, that sociality begets other caring in the way that we've seen. And that other caring, together with social learning, which we've not really talked about, begets social norms for right and for wrong. And that some problem solving in an ecology can beget norm changes. And I think we see that in many cultures. So what actually does oxytocin do, you might ask? To a first approximation, there's an interesting relation between stress hormones like cortisol and oxytocin. When oxytocin levels go up, stress hormones go down, and vice versa. And of course, when stress hormones are high, that usually means you feel anxious, you're super vigilant, you're watching, you're careful, you don't trust people. But when the oxytocin levels go up, you groom each other, that makes them go up a bit more. And life feels good, and things relax. And that's when we see an increase in levels of care and trust. And I want to give you just a bit of data on this, because so far these have all just been claims. We know that in food sharing, in wild chimpanzees, again, these experiments are very difficult to do, but in food sharing, oxytocin levels of the sharers goes up, which means stress hormones go down, which means they feel good. The other thing that I think all of our grandmothers and their grandmothers told us is that doing good feels good. And I used to think when I was a kid, oh yeah, they say that because they want to make sure you do the right thing. But it turns out there's actually evidence for it. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the evidence. So in this particular experiment, what you're looking at is pain induced by a tourniquet on the one hand, and reports by subjects of the degree to which they feel the pain. And the way this was done was you take a bunch of undergraduates, of course. You're so useful. And you randomly separate them into two groups. One group just gets paid for being a subject in the experiment. The other group is told that they are going to get paid, but then they can use their pay to help earthquake victims who are children. And that's a very fast description of what happens, but you can see the donors are in blue, and you'll see that the reports of pain as the tourniquet remains on and you get more and more uncomfortable, the reports of the feeling of pain are always less than the reports of pain by those who did not. And there's another experiment that I think is kind of good. And that is, well, that tells us about behavior in reports, but those of us who are brainophiles want to see it in the brain. So there are two particular areas that are highly sensitive to pain. And that's shown here. Again, this is a section here, a coronal section. And this is called the anterior cingulate. And the other area on each side is the anterior insula. So here's the experiment. You stuff the undergraduate in the scanner. But before you do that, or before you begin to scan, you give them the opportunity to do something altruistic, like give money to earthquake victims. And then you do a scan, then you give them pain, and then you do the scan again. And it turns out that when you look at the scans for those who agreed to do the altruistic thing, you see an actual decline in pain activity in those regions that are particularly sensitive to pain. There's a lot of data on this, and this is really just designed to give you a feel for what's there. So not only, of course, is there within species friendships and affiliations, but we see it across species. And the one at the top actually is quite cool because this poor old dog fell into a canal in Florida and was sort of drowning. And eventually a pod of dolphins came up the canal. He jumped on their back and they took him home. Oh, I kind of like this one too because, so this is an orang, famous of course for being a loner in the wilds of Borneo, and that's largely because of course of the nature of how they make a living. And he's now in a rescue center in Iowa, and one day this guy came in. And he kind of lopey-lopey comes along, and they meet up, and they have been tight friends ever since. They swim together, they eat together, they sleep together, and so on. Now, I'm telling you these stories partly because I like them, but partly because I want to suggest that when oxytocin levels go up and stress hormones go down, when there is care and when there is trust, cooperation can come of its own accord. That is, you don't actually have to have a gene or a set of genes to produce highly specific circuits for cooperation. And this one, it's not going to be very clear at first, but it's an important slide. So this is a grizzly. The wolves are cooperating to bring to get the grizzly off. And why? Because there is an elk under there. And so they harass and harass and harass the grizzly in this very cooperative, very careful, very systematic way, because you really don't want to mess with a grizzly. But the real story is this guy. So how did the wolves know where the kill was? And the answer is, especially amongst wolf pups, but amongst wolves generally, in some packs, there is a kind of fun relationship between ravens and wolves. And this has been observed many times in the far north. So what happens occasionally is that the raven knows where the kill is. He comes and plays, but kind of leads the wolves to the kill. He goes and goes hoppty, hoppty, hoppty from tree to tree. This is not an instinctive behavior. This is learned. And it's learned because both the ravens and the wolves are highly social animals, can read one another's cues, and interact. They can cooperate. But incidentally, of course, what's in it for the raven? Once the wolves are on the carcass, the raven goes and gets his pals, and then they drive off the wolves, so everybody gets some. Now, think back to the Darwin slide. So he said social instincts, habits, and skills. And I want to say a little bit now about the habits and skills part of the story. And I'm a little bit shy about talking about this because it involves learning by the reinforcement learning system. And this is the Center for Learning and Memory. And there are a lot of people in the audience who are going to know a lot more about this than I do. But never fear, we march on. So from the very earliest days, offspring, humans and others, begin to pick up the ways and the preferences of the group that they are in. Now, it turns out that an absolutely critical part of the story for that is, again, in a very ancient structure, but this time not the hypothalamus, but the brainstem. And I'm going to show you an experiment that kind of launched 1,000 ships. This is a story that was kind of one of the more remarkable stories of neuroscience in the last couple of decades. I mean, we all knew about Pavlov and his dogs, but that's at a behavioral level. What is the mechanism for producing conditioned responses or for learning anything else that counts as a habit or a skill? So I'm going to walk you through this one too. It looks worse than it is. So in the top, what you're looking at here is a series of dots. And each of those dots represents a spike of a neuron, all right? And so here is where a reward is going to be presented. So what you've done is you've put electrodes into an area in the brainstem, and you're now going to record from those neurons. And you're going to see what happens when the animal gets a reward. So the neuron goes, dit, 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 just noise, not doing anything too much. The reward comes, and all of a sudden you get a big uptick in spiking. So then the researchers thought, well, suppose we signal to the monkey that when the light goes on, he's going to get a reward. And what happens very quickly is that it goes, da, 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 da. Now comes the light, and see the big uptick here. But what happens to the reward? Same old, same old. It goes back to just, yeah, fine. However, it's also cool that when the light comes on but no reward is presented, then the spiking rate goes way down. Well, why is that so interesting? Although the researchers who originally did this didn't really understand what they were looking at, it turns out that there is a computational story to explain this. And it's that these neurons are responding to reward prediction. And they are measuring reward prediction error. When things are better than expected, they go woohoo. And if they're worse than expected, they go boo. If they're the same as expected, they stay the same. Now, funnily enough, at about the time that that was figured out, new developments in neural network, or deep learning, or AI, as we now call it, were taking place, and we're using precisely that computation in order to train up neural networks to do things like voice recognition on your iPhone. So I think we'll just leave that one out. So that tells us a little bit about what you might call conditioning, but we know now, after studying this system that connects regions in the brainstem with regions in the cortex, that the reward system is capable of doing a lot more than just dinky conditioning. That when you learn by imitation, when you learn by counterfactuals, that is, you think, oh, I should have done that instead of this, or when you learn by being punished for a choice, you burn your hand or whatever it is, then their responses are organized by this reinforcement learning system in the brainstem. So we learn norms that way as well. And this goes back again to Darwin and the idea of social instincts. We couldn't learn social norms by our reward learning system if we didn't care about approval and disapproval, or if we didn't care about reward and punishment in the social domain. We do care, and that's how we pick up norms. But I don't think that by and large these norms are super strict norms. They are very conditional. They are situation sensitive. They are adaptable. And we use the core cases stored in our brains about what counts as a good moral decision to compare our current option with that stored case. But life is never easy, and norms conflict with our preferences. Sometimes they conflict with other norms. Should we be loyal or should we be honest? Sometimes norms vary across individuals. Some people have very different views about certain aspects of taxation, shall we say. So it's complex, and many, I think of the now this is going to be the part where I'm a little bit rude, maybe quite rude actually. Much of moral philosophy in the 20th century was driven by the assumption that there should be one ultimate rule to which all other rules are beholden. And that one rule was universal, would hold for all people in all times and in all conditions. And when I look at things biologically, when I look at what we are and how we come to have norms and norm changes, it seems to me that it's a misbegotten project. And finally, the last slide is for the evolutionary biologists. If sociality is pleasurable, and highly social animals do find it so, we may engage in many behaviors that are largely unrelated to passing on our genes. Namaste. You're going to take questions then?
Well, that was fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Churchland. And we have a little bit of time for questions. There are two folks down here and one upstairs with a microphone. So if you raise your hand, they will come to you, and we'll kind of go round robin a little bit, take some questions, and then afterwards we'll adjourn to the outside. Maybe we'll start, where shall we start? Right there? Mike coming?
She has a question.
Yep. Microphones are on the way.
Yeah, she
Yep,
does.
go ahead, right there.
In the example you gave of the males occasionally either participating in, say, orphan care or bonding forever and taking care of pup care, have there been any specific studies on why biology selects certain males of certain mammal groups to behave that way and others so closely related not behave that way?
No, it's a really good question, and I think many people were surprised when Chris Besh published this account of the male chimpanzees adopting, because the view was, as I'm sure you know, male and female chimpanzees do not bond. They get on, obviously, but they do not form long-term attachments. And so I think the assumption really was that, you know, the maternal care belongs to the mom, the baby care. And so it was very surprising. But it is a really interesting question. And probably many of these behaviors, I don't know how quite to put this, but they're a little bit latent there in everybody. I mean, think of that orang. In the wild, that orang would have been a loner, and there it was with the dog. And the more we learn about how there can be epigenetic as well as genetic changes, the more we realize that the things can shade off into other. So I think it's a wonderful question, and I'm sure anthropologists would love to know the answer, but we don't.
Okay, let's take some other questions. I think one is being run to the back. Yep, go ahead.
Could you say some more about why people no longer believe that a norm is universal? You ended with it, but could you elaborate, please?
Well, I think that the recognition is that very often a norm will work well enough for some cases, but then a case will arise where you don't want to adhere to the norm. Now, Kant took the view that, poor old Kant, anyway, he took the view that you must always tell the truth, that there is no condition under which a lie is appropriate. Well, you know, if the Nazis come knocking at my door and ask me if I'm hiding any Jews, and I am, I'm certainly going to lie. You know. So I think that it's that sort of recognition that these things, I mean, Confucius basically nailed it. He said, these are rules of thumb. They are rules that are meant to guide you, but they are not meant to be applied always and unconditionally. And I think Adam Smith and David Hume, you know, saw the same thing. But the other thing is that, you know, we see norms shift over time, and we see people's attitudes shift over time. In the book, I talk about my Catholic friends in school who were not allowed to eat fish on Friday. But then when we were in 10th grade, I mean, who had to eat fish on Friday, could not eat meat on Friday. So when we were in 10th grade, the Pope changed his mind, and it was okay. But they had internalized this horror of the Friday meatball. I mean, you know, you can't do it. I just can't. But I didn't have that. So, you know, I'd tuck into a Friday meatball with gusto. So, but there are other things that are more serious than that, where we do come to change our minds. And I think the attitudes that people have towards homosexuality has changed so profoundly in my lifetime. I would not have predicted this 50 years ago. But it's a very interesting phenomenon. And sociologists, of course, are very interested in how that happens and what makes the differences and so on and so forth. So I think it's those kinds of things that make us want to say, you know, there aren't universal norms. Yeah.
That's a little different. So, one is the same society changing its mind. The other is whether the same norms apply across.
Well, I think you're still stuck with Kant's problem on telling the truth. You know, I mean, generally speaking, you want to tell the truth, and you don't want to lie for self-serving reasons. But, you know, there are cases, obviously, where the right thing to do is to lie. I think we should,
Yeah, I mean, Pat, if I'm understanding correctly.
Maybe I'm missing the point.
Well, I think that there's maybe a differentiation between universality of certain principles and ideals that are embodied, for example, in legal systems that we share across cultures, traditions, different countries. There are certain things that we all sort of generally agree are not appropriate moral or conscious decisions. But you're saying there are always exceptions to these rules, and it always depends on context, and that has to, you know, also have its evolutionary value.
Yeah, I think I did misunderstand. Yeah, I think that we have to also recognize that different cultures may, especially if their ecology is very different, may just have a different way of handling things. I mean, the Inuit are particularly interesting in this way because they were extraordinarily successful given that they were living in the most difficult of conditions. And they certainly had sort of social practices that structured their social lives. But they considered as acceptable things that we probably would not. You know, you have too many female babies. You can't, you know, you got to have hunters. You got to have people out there bringing in the whales and the seals. You got too many females. Another female is born. Now, that's hard. And maybe our society doesn't do it because we're not up against it in the way that the Inuit were. I mean, they regularly starved or had months where they had no food. And that may put a different perspective on it. And you think to yourself, well, I could never imagine doing that with a female baby. Well, just maybe try to imagine a little harder. I mean, put yourself in their shoes, or their boots, I guess.
Okay, other questions up here?
I have a question.
Sorry.
Back here, way at the back.
There we go. Okay, I'm trying to figure out where the mic is. It's very hard to see from here.
So it is a continuation. This was a fabulous talk. I loved it. It was also very kind of optimistic about the world, so I like that too. But I would like to kind of push you a little bit about the collaboration, I guess, between moral philosophy and brain science.
Oh, yeah.
Because you really stressed description as opposed to moral philosophy, which is, you know, thinking about oughts. And at a certain level, if you don't go into moral philosophy, then you have to be wedded to a certain type of moral relativism, I think, which is a theme that has come up. And so I guess I would be more interested in how the science of morality and the philosophy of morality can interact, because, I mean, I think, I have to say, your depiction of Kant was a little bit... So I think of Kant as his main principle is the idea not that you can't tell a lie, but that we should treat all people as ends in themselves and not merely as means. So it's a kind of fundamental principle of respect and autonomy, which I think that there are good arguments you could make that this is something that is could be a foundational principle. And I could see how that view of Kant could actually be worked in a cooperative way with the idea of sociality that you have depicted. So, because you did sort of try to appear to dismiss the role of moral philosophy as in relation to descriptive, ultimately relativist views of morality.
Well, I guess two things. Thank you for that. The first is I'm interested in the origins of morality. Where does it come from? Why are we like this? You know, why aren't we like bears who are loners? But we're not. We really are not. And because we really do see people care about others and incur a cost to themselves. We see this quite regularly. So I'm interested in the origin of that. But this isn't really the time, I guess, to have a long discussion about what's wrong with Kant. But
Oh, for the
I'm
love
sure
of
you
God,
all
Pat,
want to
not
know.
now. I don't think we can do that today.
No. But the thing of it is, what's wrong with Aristotle? I mean, philosophers, when they read my book, hate it because I don't like Kant. But I do like Aristotle. I mean, what, is he chopped liver? I mean, so it's not that I have no philosophical interest. It's just that the philosophers that seem to me to give us a story about morality that has a way of fitting with our neurobiology, our anthropology, and our psychology. It's Aristotle, it's David Hume. I mean, he was a philosopher, actually, David Hume. So, you know, yeah, I don't like Kant because I think he said a lot of really silly things about morality. And I know that I'm not supposed to say that. I'm supposed to speak reverentially. But I did tell you that I was going to be a little bit rude.
I think we can organize a whole retreat around this. So I think on that note, Pat, you've just been a great sport. Thank you so much. And thank you all.
Okay.
In fact, so thank you. We wanted to give you this.
Oh!
And this is in appreciation.